reason is by its nature architectonic. That is, it views all cognitions as belonging to a possible system. Immanuel Kant. The last 6 weeks I spent talking about not the actual content of Kant's philosophy yet, but rather about what philosophy means to Kant, both according to its school sense and according to the world sense of the word, and in which role he sees the philosopher. And now, before getting to Kant's own philosophy and its own philosophical thoughts, there is one more general topic I first want to talk about, and that is how to do philosophy. That is Kant's method of thinking. This is a topic that I find often gets neglected, not just when it comes to Kant, but rather when it comes to any philosopher. That is true definitely for popular works and introductions on a specific philosopher, like books on Kant or other philosophers or videos here on YouTube. But that is true even at university. People talk about or want to learn about what is the categorical imperative in Kant's thought, or what is the Übermensch in Nietzsche's thought, or what is Plato's teaching of the ideas. But they spend less time asking how did Kant arrive at his categorical imperative? How did Nietzsche arrive at the idea of his Übermensch? How did Plato arrive at his doctrine of the ideas? And that, I think, is very unfortunate, because there are two good reasons why you should spend time trying to understand not just the what of what a philosopher has thought, but also the how. How did he come to this what? The first reason is that it provides a key to understanding that specific philosopher better. If you know how he thought, you can understand how he came to the conclusions that he came to. They are then no longer random opinions, but they follow from his way of thinking. I talked about in my lecture on what is science, I talked about how actual science is not just an aggregate. According to Kant, it is systematic, and it is systematic by deducing the specific cases from a general law, understanding that the specific cases have to be that way because of the general law. With Fichte, I said that science is genetic, seeing the specific cases genetically come into being out of a general law. But that can be applied to the thoughts of philosophers or of people in general too. If you know the law ruling their thinking, you understand better that their various views are not just pieces, not just random opinions, but rather they follow from that law of thinking. And this is also important not just when you want to understand a philosopher, but also when you want to criticize him. Because now, if you know his method, you can ask the question, if you think that he is wrong in some instance, you can ask the question, why is he wrong? Did he correctly apply his method, and did his method lead him to what you think is a wrong conclusion? In that case, you must criticize the very method. Or might it be the case that the method is fine and good, but he is wrong here because in this instance he was not consistent with himself and he failed to correctly apply his own method. And I will already say that in the case of Kant, and of course Kant was wrong in some instances, in the case of Kant, it's rather the latter and not the first of these two options. But secondly, the second reason why it is good and important to deal with a philosopher's methods is that you yourself can learn from that. In the last lecture, I talked about how Kant again and again stressed that you can't learn philosophy. You can only learn how to philosophize. Your philosophy has to come out of your own intellect, not out of someone else's. Well, what does that mean other than you cannot learn the content of a philosophy? I mean, you can learn it historically, you can become historically aware of it, but that doesn't mean that you really have this philosophy in your heart or that you can really judge it. But you can learn the method of doing philosophy. And for me, I mean, I'm an aufklärer. What I really care about is teaching people how to think, how to judge, how to lead their own lives in freedom and in a life-affirming way. And therefore, this is a topic that seems very important to me. Even if you disagree with a philosopher on certain things, or maybe even on almost all things, you might still find value in his method, and you might still find the method useful for your own thinking. I mean, there are examples of this in history. Marx dismissed more or less all of Hegel's philosophy. Famously, the claim is that he turned Hegel from his head onto his feet. He dismissed Hegel's idealism, and he himself subscribed to the opposite, to materialism. But nevertheless, Marx took up the dialectical method that Hegel used in his idealistic thought and applied it to his materialistic thought. Now, if you ask me, that was a big error, but nonetheless, it is an example that shows how it is possible to take up a method and to take up a method even if you disagree with what was done with that method so far. So for that reason, I want to spend a bit of time talking about Kant's methods. Namely, there are four methods: his architectonic, his skeptical method, his critical method, and his sympathetic or participating method. And finally, I also want to talk about the advice Kant gives on how to read books. The first method of Kant's that I'm going to address is his architectonic method. Science, as I already explained in my lecture on what is science according to Kant, science is about knowledge. The very name says so, coming from the Latin word for knowing. Now, when you have several pieces of knowledge, several cognitions, and you don't want them to be a mere rhapsody, you don't want them to be completely unstructured and disorderly and chaotic, and everything unstructured and disorderly is unreasonable. Reason always demands a structure. Reason always demands everything all the multiplicity coming from 1, then you have to give your various cognitions a structure. And here Kant says there are only 2 ways in which you can do this. One of them is structuring your cognitions technically. The word technique, here you can think back to my lecture on what is wisdom to Kant, where I talked about him calling the regular scientists technicians of reason, because they use their knowledge, or can use their knowledge, to reach and achieve any possible purpose without reflecting deeper about what should be their final purpose. The word technique to Kant always denotes doing something in service of, using your reason in service of an arbitrary, random goal. So you can give a technical order, a technical structure to your cognitions according to arbitrarily chosen characteristics. So, for example, Kant says you could structure your cognitions by their similarities, even though those similarities are just contingent and not necessary. It's like if I were to order the books in my shelves, for example, by the color of their covers, or by how thick they are, going from the biggest volumes to the smallest books. Or alternatively, you could choose an order based on your arbitrary purposes. So, keeping with the example of the bookshelf, I could, for example, order my shelf by how much I like the books. So I could put my favorite books where I can easily access them, while putting the books I don't like up there where I can't reach them anyways. But again, these orders are arbitrary. They are not necessary. Now, the other possibility is to create a true system, not just an aggregate, but a true system, where every part is a necessary part of the whole. It being there is necessary, and it being at this exact spot and not in another spot within the whole is also necessary. And such a system is created not through a technical structuring, but through an architectonic structuring. So therefore, Kant calls the architectonic method, the art of systems. It is a way to construct a system of cognition. And now, if you listen to my lecture on what is science to Kant, I said that to him, science is systematic cognition. So therefore, if the architectonic is the art of the systems, then it is the method by which we create science. And indeed, Kant says it is the teaching or the doctrine of the scientific in our knowledge, in our cognitions. It is the way by which we turn knowledge we may have into scientific knowledge. And this is needed, Kant says, especially for the rational sciences. Once more, I refer back to my lecture on science. There I explained that Kant says the systematic, the scientific knowledge or cognition can either be historical, if it's mere not true knowledge, but mere awareness of facts, awareness of how things are, gained through research and observation. Or the systematic cognition can be rational science, not just historical scholarship, but rational science. And that is about true insight and understanding, because here you are not just aware that something is the case, but you know it, and you know that it must be the case because you understand the law through which it came into being. And these rational sciences were mathematics and the philosophical sciences, which includes logic and morals and metaphysics, but which also includes the natural science. So all of these rational sciences, mathematics and philosophical science, they especially need this architectonic method. It can also somewhat be applied to historical scholarship. That should also be structured systematically to be scientific at all, Kant would say. But it can somewhat do without that systematic structure, and it also can never become a true system. But for the rational sciences, for mathematics and philosophy, this architectonic method is needed, Kant says. This architectonic requires that you first have an idea of the science. You need to have an idea of the whole of the science, of what it is about, what it deals with, and from that idea you can then deduce the parts of that science. Now, what exactly an idea is, because that term holds a specific meaning in Kant's philosophy, that I will talk about more extensively when I talk about what reason means to Kant. But for now, it is enough to say that an idea is a concept of pure reason. It is not something empirical. It is not something we got out of experience. It is something we can only think, and we can only arrive at through our own reason. And this idea is needed because only in reason there is necessity. What we know through experience is never necessary. If we just find the various parts that would belong to a science empirically and then try to put them together, once again, that could only be done technically. For example, by going by the similarities that we spot in these various parts. But if we want them to be connected in a system where their connection, where their order is necessary, then experience must not lead and guide us, but only reason can tell us how to do that. So we first need this idea, and this, Kant says, is the hardest part. Once we have that idea, deducing the architectonic of a science from there is not actually that hard. But first we must get to that idea, and that can take centuries or millennia. So Kant does say that the idea is always there from the start, from when people begin working on a science, but it is only there unconsciously at first. They have a vague idea of what they are doing or trying to do, and that vague idea guides them into somewhat the right direction. But it can take a lot of time before that idea becomes more clear and before people become more conscious of the idea. When that happens, when we finally reach clarity, that is the biggest possible revolution that can happen in a science, Kant says. Everything before that is basically just a trial and error, is basically just trying to get towards that science. But the real systematic science only starts once the idea has been found and once the architectonic system can be created. And Kant is very much aware of the fact that this takes a long time. This is not how ideally it should be, but this is how it is. This can be compared with how the state comes into being. Kant would say that, of course, ideally, so if we go by what reason demands, ideally the way it should have been is people coming together and creating a free contract through which they create a free and rational society with rational laws, with just laws. But Kant is very much aware that that is not how it historically went or ever could have went. He is very much aware that historically the state rather starts with power and not with a free contract. It starts with someone usurping power and starting to oppress others. And from then on, it goes on, and it can take millennia to slowly, step by step, through many struggles and revolutions and so on, reform the state and step by step make it more rational, make it more just. And just the same is true for the sciences. Ideally, the idea should come at the start, and first an architectonic plan of the whole science should be drawn up, and then people should start doing that science and finding knowledge in that area. But what actually happened is that first people acquired some knowledge in that area, half not even knowing what they were doing, and only over time, slowly, step by step, can science be reformed and walked closer and closer to the actual idea it should be guided by. What this idea does is it provides us with a plan of what to do. And it is with good reason that Kant calls this architectonic, because it is somewhat like constructing a house. In a system, Kant says, the parts come from the whole, they are necessary within the whole. It's not like in an aggregate where the parts are there first and they are just randomly put together into a whole. I spoke about this already in my lecture on what is science to Kant. And there I said that he compares the aggregate with a pile of sand, while the system can be compared with an organic body. In the pile of sand, the parts are there first. So each little grain of sand exists on its own and for itself. It doesn't just exist as part of this pile. And they are just then put together, but that is not necessary. They could also be independent. And their places in that pile are not necessary either. On the other hand, in an organic body, the parts like the heart, the brain, the hand, the eyes, they don't exist randomly and independently of the body, only coming together to form it, but rather the way we have to think of an organic being, Kant says, is we have to imagine it as if it was constructed according to a plan. Now, whether that plan was the plan of some conscious creator, of some creator god, or whether that plan is the genetical code, that's not said here. But we can't help but thinking of a plan coming first, and thinking of the parts being planned in this, thinking of the parts coming into being as parts of the whole, not as independent entities, coming into being as they have been planned. And this is just, to come back to the architectonic, this is just what you do when building a house. You don't just walk around randomly taking up parts, finding some stones lying around here, finding a piece of wood there, and then somehow putting them together to construct some sort of building. If you were doing that, you wouldn't know what you are actually doing, and you wouldn't know what the end goal is, how the house you are building was supposed to look like, and you would never know when you are actually done. Like you wouldn't know, is the building ready to be lived in now, or is there maybe an important pillar missing, and without that pillar it would all break apart and fall down very soon. You don't know that if you don't have an architectonic plan of how the whole should look like. But when you build a house correctly, then what you do, or what the architect does, is you first draw up a plan of the whole, and from that plan the parts follow. Like from that plan you now know, okay, here I need a pillar to hold some of the weight of the further stories and so on, and then from that plan you know which parts, which materials you will now need. And that has the added benefit of also knowing when something is still missing. In my lecture on science, I said that Kant compares the system not just with an organic body, but also with a pyramid as contrasted to the pile of sand. And I said that while in the pile of sand, you don't know when one piece of grain is missing. In a pyramid, when one stone is missing, even if that stone is not so important that the whole pyramid breaks down without it, you will still notice that here at this specific place there is a hole that ought to be filled. Here a stone is missing. Nowadays, of course, if we look at our sciences, they don't look much like pyramids. They may be very big. They have grown tremendously since the days of Kant. But there is often order and structure lacking. It is like you're building a big castle and you are adding a tower here and then adding a side building there. But over there is a window missing that could be added. That is, of course, because nowadays we don't work with an architectonic method. We work with a technical method. And that, once again, I talked about a topic related to this in the lecture on what is wisdom. That once again is quite consistent with the rest of our time, with the zeitgeist. Because this is a day and age where we are very much focused on the empirical. And again, the empirical can only lead to a technical connection between our cognitions. And this is a day and age of a-rationalism, where we dismiss reason and therefore we don't look at ideas. Because once again, an idea is something that I can't find in experience. An idea is something that I can only think through pure reason. And I will add, I will explain this in a further lecture more extensively when I talk about ideas, but I will add that to Kant, idea always is something practical. An idea is not merely theoretical, it's not merely something by which we understand something, but it always has a practical component. It always is about how we should do something, what we should strive for. And this, of course, can be seen here as well. The idea of a science provides us with the architectonic plan through which the science should be constructed. And this idea, Kant would say, needs to be derived from the actual purpose of the science. So we need to understand what this science truly is about, or truly should be about, which purpose should it serve. Only through that can we truly know what that science should and what it shouldn't include. And this, of course, is closely related to what I said in my lecture on wisdom. I said that Kant calls the regular scientist merely a technician of reason, using his reason, using his knowledge, using his science to achieve this or that purpose. But that the philosopher to him, the philosopher in the world sense, so the wise man, the sage, he should be the lawgiver of reason, and therefore also the governor of the sciences, because he alone is focused on the final purpose and the true vocation of humanity. And this means, I would say, even if Kant may not be quite as explicit about it, this means that the architectonic method is the job of the philosopher as the lawgiver. The philosopher should conceive the idea of a science and from that deduce the general plan of the science, while the specific scientist should then follow that plan. So the philosopher, if we once again compare it with building a house, the philosopher should be like the architect, and then the scientists in the various fields, they should be like the construction workers, following that architect's plan. So I will once again remind you of what I said in that lecture. I said that in actuality, it is not that the philosopher should be some ruler that others blindly obey to, but rather the true meaning of Kant is that all the scientists should be philosophers. So they themselves, the construction workers themselves, so to say, should be the architects who don't just blindly work constructing something without knowing what they are constructing, but rather so that they know what they are doing. Well, so much about the architectonic method itself. Now I want to say some more words about it relating to Kant specifically. He placed great importance in that method, and the 3 lectures I previously gave on what is science, what is philosophy, and what is metaphysics to Kant, these 3 lectures can give testament to that. And I recommend, if you want to get a better picture of what this architectonic system of sciences, what that means, I recommend listening to these 3 lectures, because that is where I lay out Kant's architectonic system. I would say that maybe out of all of Kant's methods, this one is the most specific, the most idiosyncratic to him. Like his other methods, they are not just Kant's methods. Like, for example, the skeptical method, he himself says that he got it from previous thinkers, even from ancient thinkers like Socrates and Pyrrhon. And his sympathetic or participating method, that has very much had influence on the thinkers that came after him. And that has gone on to be developed into the dialectical method of Hegel, which in turn was taken up by Marx. But this architectonic method, that is more specifically than anything else Kant's. And it is, of course, very Baroque. I can't really imagine a thinker who lived at any other time but the 18th century being this systematic and architectonic, but it should be taken seriously. To Kant, it was very important to lay down the necessary structure of science and the necessary fields, the necessary sub-subjects of science. Only thereby you could know which tasks you have. And even if a certain task can't be solved, it is still a task. Like if you understand that according to the idea of science, or more specifically of philosophical science, or even more specifically of metaphysics, according to that idea, there needs to be a rational theology. So a science where you use reason to think about God, to think about that super sensual object from which all other objects, all sensual objects might come. That is necessary as a task. Now, it may turn out, as indeed it turns out within Kant's critical philosophy, that such a rational theology can't do much, can't achieve much. Our reason can't even know if there is a God or if there isn't. But still, we have this idea of a God, and we have this idea of a science dealing with him, and therefore it is a task set for us by reason. And if it is a task, as it indeed is, that can't be solved, then at least what we do have to do is find out and understand that it can't be solved, so that we don't continue further trying, but understand that all further attempts are futile. And likewise, it was very important to Kant to properly separate the different sciences and to draw the correct lines between them, which previously wasn't done. So, for example, metaphysics included rational psychology. So the metaphysical science of the soul, the science asking, is our soul immortal? How is our soul connected with the body? How does it come into connection with the body? Does that happen at birth, at conception, and so on? But also there is empirical psychology, which is more or less that science which still nowadays is called psychology. So a science that tries to study the soul or the psyche and study empirically what happens in the soul, how human beings tend to feel and to think and to behave and to react to certain things. And back in Kant's days in the 18th century, those two were mixed up. And empirical psychology, or what little empirical psychology there was, because, of course, back then that was a subject that only slowly started coming into being, was included in metaphysics. It was included in lectures and in books on metaphysics. They would dedicate a chapter or whatever to what we knew about the human soul and the human thinking and feelings through observation. But Kant, through his Architectonics, would separate the two. I talked about this in my lecture on metaphysics. He would say that no, empirical psychology is part of natural science, of applied natural science. It is the science of the inner nature, as opposed to physics being the science of the outer nature. While on the other hand, rational psychology, dealing with what reason itself, not empirical observation of how we think and feel, but reasonable, rational thinking about what is a soul, what is a thinking being, what that might tell us about the nature of our soul. This rational psychology belongs within metaphysics. It is part of applied metaphysics. And that is very important to separate these completely different fields, and to also recognize that they work differently. That one of them works through experience, through observation, maybe experiment, and the other works through rational speculation. And keeping the sciences apart like that, and also understanding that the various fields might work according to different principles, that they might try to find knowledge through different means, that also helps in understanding what a science can or can't do. So, for example, I talked in my lecture on metaphysics about how Kant says there is pure metaphysics, that is cosmology and theology, and there is applied metaphysics, that is rational psychology and also rational physics. And I mentioned how all four might be metaphysical science, because all four are speculative. All four are not relying on experience, on observation, but on rational speculation. But nevertheless, there is a big difference, because in rational psychology and rational physics, our reason is still immanent, or domestic, as Kant says, because here we are trying to have rational cognition, but the objects we are trying to have cognition about are still objects that we know about empirically. We have experience of their being thinking beings and extended beings, soul and body. And on the other hand, in cosmology and theology, our reason is completely transcendent, so swinging over experience into a realm that is completely beyond experience. Because when we think about God, for example, it's not just that we can't observe God's attributes, we can't even observe God's existence. We are thinking about a mere idea without having any experience that tells us that this object we are trying to have knowledge about even exists. And this I will talk about further when I discuss Kant's critical philosophy, but this is exactly what will lead to Kant's conclusion that applied metaphysics is possible. So we can have general knowledge out of pure reason, a priori, so before any observations, about souls and bodies. But pure metaphysics, where our reason is transcendent, is not possible as a positive science, as a science yielding new knowledge. Precisely because here the difference is that we don't even know if the object we are thinking about and reasoning about, speculating about, if that object even exists, or if all we are doing is just throwing around empty ideas. So that is why the architectonic is so important to Kant and so fruitful in its consequences. And to him, it was also a confirmation of the truth of his philosophy, because what he found is that in the various fields of philosophy, so in the critique of pure reason, he would deal with theoretical philosophy. In the critique of practical reason, he would deal with practical philosophy. In the critique of the judgment power, he would somewhat deal with their connection. And he would find again and again that there are certain parallelisms, that the same structures repeat again and again, that the same solution that works in one field also works in the other, which shouldn't be surprising, because at the end of the day, it is one reason. The reason can be used theoretically or practically, but it's not two different reasons, a theoretical and a practical reason. It's just one and the same reason used in different fields in different ways, and therefore, of course, it will always have the same nature. It will always have the same structure. And this was a big confirmation to Kant. Like when he finished thinking about one field and he went into another field, even if he didn't try and set out to replicate the structure or the argument that had worked in one field, he found that naturally the result would be parallel to the result he had reached before. And that to him, once again, was a big confirmation. And it is for that reason that I think it is very unfortunate that nowadays, when people talk about Kant, so once again, when you look at other videos on YouTube, for example, that try to explain Kant, in most cases you probably won't even hear the word architectonics. I find it very unfortunate that nowadays, when Kant is discussed, this isn't focused on more. I would claim that without understanding the structure of Kant's system, without understanding, so to say, if we go with its comparison between a system and an organic body, without understanding its anatomy, without understanding, so to say, its skeleton, its bone structure, then you can't truly understand Kant. And that is also why a lot of criticism that has been directed against Kant in the last over 200 years, and that still is directed against Kant, a lot of that criticism can be dismissed without even really being discussed, because a lot of that criticism is very shallow and fails to take into account the architectonic structure of Kant's system. So critics will usually not look at the whole and will not consider that Kant would say the idea of the whole comes first, and the respective parts, they are necessary within that whole, but rather critics will mostly focus on one specific part of Kant's thought and criticize that part. It is like if we once again compare it to a house, building a house, it is like you attack the architect for putting up a pillar here at this exact spot and saying, well, yeah, I don't focus on the rest of the house, but just this specific pillar I don't like. It doesn't look good. It should be put away. But you don't realize that this pillar is holding up the whole structure, maybe. And if you were to remove that pillar, the whole house would break down. So it is not possible to criticize the architect for that pillar alone. You could maybe criticize his whole plan. You could say the whole house should have been built completely differently. But if you accept the house as the whole, you have to accept the pillar as it is. And that is true within Kant's system. So, for example, let's pick out just one example, Kant's philosophy of beauty. Kant says that there are 3 types of pleasure, 3 types of enjoyment. One is the pleasant or agreeable. So that is that which physically pleases us, like good food, comfort, good sex, whatever. One is moral agreement. So when you are content with something because you judge it to be morally right, when you are happy about world peace being achieved or whatever. And then the one in between those two is exactly the pleasure we get from beauty. Now, what exactly all this means and what exactly Kant says about this, I will address in a later lecture. But for now, I just want to say there are people who dismiss Kant's philosophy of beauty and to say that the beautiful is not its own kind of pleasure. They would like to view it as merely physical enjoyment. So they would say that a beautiful person to us is the same as an attractive person, while Kant would say there's a big difference between the two. And of course you could make that claim. Of course you could say that Kant is wrong here. But the problem is there need to be 3 kinds of pleasure within Kant's system. This is not a random number. Kant didn't randomly say that beauty is its own kind of pleasure and separate from what is merely pleasant or agreeable. But rather, you will find that within Kant's system, this threefoldness always returns. Kant also talks about 3 types of evil, but also 3 types of goodness. He talks about human nature being threefold. Again and again, there is this number 3. And these various threes, it's not just about a mere number, but about their content, they are always parallel to each other. Because it's always one sensual, one intellectual, and one in between that is a mix of the two. For example, in human nature, humans are, of course, animals like other animals. They are sensual beings, but they are also spiritual beings. And then they are a combination of the two. They are rational or intellectual animals. And therefore, within the structure of that system, it is necessary to assume that there's also a purely sensual pleasure. There is a purely intellectual pleasure, that is agreeing with something morally. And there must be a third pleasure in between, that is both sensual and intellectual in a way. And that, once again, is the beautiful to Kant. So, a critic doesn't need to be taken seriously if he just attacks Kant's thoughts on the beautiful, because then he clearly shows that he hasn't understood the wider system. If anything, he would have to attack this whole threefoldness, which of course you could do. I'm not saying that you are not allowed to criticize Kant, but what I am saying is that when you do criticize, you have to take into account that certain parts can't just be removed from the whole. Certain parts are necessary within the whole. So if you disagree with that part, you by necessity must disagree with the whole and not just with the part. And therefore it is very much necessary, if you want to understand Kant truly, to understand the architectonics of a system. And therefore this is one thing I want to focus about in my future lectures. Again and again, pointing out this repeating and parallel structure when it appears. I will say right away that there are two keys to Kant's architectonics. There are two things you really need to understand, or you won't understand Kant at all. One of them is his table of the 12 categories, according to which all of our thinking is structured, or of the 12 ways of judgments from which those 12 categories are deduced. So Kant would say there are 12 ways in which we can make judgments. These 12 again are grouped into 4 groups of 3. And then those 4 groups are once again grouped into 2 classes of 2 groups each. And this is a structure, this 12-foldness, or also often just 4-foldness according to the 4 groups, which repeats again and again in Kant's thought. And the second one that is probably less well known, like anyone who deals with Kant somewhat and anyone who reads the Critique of Pure Reason at least knows about the table of categories. But the second one is a bit less well known, and I would assume that even some Kant scholars don't realize how important it is to Kant's system and how often this second structure repeats. But the second one is this structure of 3 that I already addressed. It is the structure of the 3 human natures, being a sensual animal, being an intellectual spirit, and being a mixture of both, being an intellectual animal. Both of these I won't explain further in this lecture. I will talk about the table of categories, and I will talk about the 3 human natures in future lectures. For now, you don't have to understand them completely, but for now I just wanted to point out that these 2 have to be understood if you want to get Kant's thoughts at all. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Kubilai Celik, Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samit Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring course.